Okay, sorry I was a little bit late. Hopefully we're in the home stretch here, getting ready for the finals. So this week we're going to cover sections 2 and 3 for the final exam. So today we're going to cover section 2. It's going to be covering essentially JavaScript. I don't think we're going to be able to get through the whole thing today. So just remember, I recorded a session on arrays and stuff and loops. So let me share that with you guys. Okay, so over here in my media, we have a couple of different ones here. And you can see one that I published here was with arrays. So doing the whole thing between declaration, initializing, traversing, and updating arrays. I'll try to do a little bit of an array example near the end, but in case I don't get to it, you can always refer to this video that we recorded. So this is, again, in my media, okay? So let's go back to the learning objectives. You can see in the announcement that was made, the different learning objectives were put out there. So what I have here, you see, is the exam 2 learning objectives. So here, so I'm just going to kind of run through these. Let me see if I can try to cover all these different things here. Okay, so you can remember probably, I guess it's been about a month or so ago. You can see at the beginning when we talked about JavaScript, we gave the intro talking about algorithms, heuristics, talking about flowcharts, pseudocode, things like variables, different types of variables and whatnot. So let me click on a couple of things here. You can also see on here you have a couple of resources. One is the flowchart symbols. You have also the pseudocode reference, an example of algorithm. So you can see here, like on the pseudocode, you guys will have all this available to you when you run the exam. So you can just follow some of these examples here. But basically, it just kind of works through at a high level. And what I'm going to do is I'll show you something here. I have an example flowchart and then have that translated into code for you. So I'll step into that in a second here. Okay. So you have different things. Try to review in terms of what are legal types of variables, nesting conditions. So it was a very common case in terms of like the if-else, and I'll have an example of that also here. Okay, so let me come back over here. All right. So let me see here. Let's start off with the variables here. So for JavaScript variables, you might remember, these are the different types of things to say whether it's a valid variable. So you don't want to have spaces. You can have the name start off with a letter, underscore, or a dollar sign. And you can only have letters, numbers, underscores, or dollar signs overall. You remember for JavaScript, the variable names are case sensitive. And then we didn't really hit on it too much, but you should also note that things like this are bad names, bad words to use for variables, because these are like parts of keywords for JavaScript, so it'll get confused if you try to declare a variable with these type of names. And you can see that when you go over to this link here. I mean, this is only a couple of them here, so you can see a full list of names that are not good to use as variable names. So these are the general ones here. So you can imagine, I think there were some questions like this on the second exam for you to pick what are valid variable names. So this is something you should probably try and review. Okay, so here, this is example flowchart. You remember the shapes here. You have the oval for start and end. You have process here with these rectangles. You have these parallelograms for in and out. You have these diamond shapes for decisions, okay? And you also remember, we kind of did an example in class also. You don't really want to, you know, in this case, you're basically taking in 3 numbers and you're trying to pick the lowest number. So one way to do it would just be kind of going straight down. You just kind of do if statement all the way through, and you're kind of making the same number of comparisons no matter what. But I think in terms of looking at a pattern, you want to say, okay, if it meets the first criteria, you shouldn't keep on making these other comparisons. So you kind of nest it like this. So this will translate into a if else all the way down to the end here. Okay. So basically with the 3 numbers, it's just checking, you know, one versus the other 2 to see whether it's the lowest number or not. And it kind of goes all the way through to here. So I'm going to hop over to the other screen where I put this into code. Okay. So you can see up here, I declared some variables. The main ones for this part where I'm talking to is just number 1, 2, and 3. And I set them, I initialized them 10, 20, and 30. Okay, so you can see I put a whole bunch of different code examples here. And these are just kind of covering different points on the learning objectives. So this is, you know, talking about both declaring the variable and initializing the variable. All right, so I'm declaring this, and I'm going to initialize it to 10, 20, and 30. Okay, I'll cover these other 2 in a second. So, and I'll cover this also here. But the point for matching up to a flowchart is this part over here. Okay, so again, it's nesting, right? So you have your if statement here, and you're comparing the number 1 is less than 2. Note the and, right? So these double ampersand signs is your and number 1 is less than number 3. Okay, so if number 1 is the lowest number, we're just going to do a document write and say number 1 is the lowest value. Okay, and you can see that over here. Okay, I'll just run it here, and you can see that. And then you can see these other if else. It's basically covering for number 2 and number 3, see if they're lowest. Now, the 2 of the lowest, if the lowest number happens to be 2 values, then it's going to fall over here and say the values are too similar. Okay. All right. So that is pretty basic, but it should match up to the flow chart that I just showed you back here. Okay. So that ties to that. And if you actually look at the pseudocode sheet, so you can see on the pseudocode, it's not quite exactly the same thing. This one is looking for the largest of 3 numbers, but it's the same type of idea, right? So this is in pseudocode, and then this is in the actual implementation. So that kind of takes you on the 3 variations for that chapter, okay? So I set up these couple other extra things here just to cover off on some of the other learning objectives or points here, so I can kind of cover a couple of different examples with the same code. So one is the idea of a Boolean variable. So here, this is success value, and I'm setting it to be a true. So Boolean variable is either a true or a false. So in this case, I'm initializing it to true. Okay, and then I'll come back to alpha num in a second. Now, when I come down to here, I'm basically setting it to be true. It's defaulting to true, so I don't set anything actually. So then that means I successfully came into here, and I'm printing out, and the value is true, which you see right over here. Okay. And then if I come down to here, this will be one thing I would note. So I just put a reminder here to cover this. So when you talk about logical, you remember the double ampersand is for and, this is for or, and this is for not, right? So you remember success value was defaulted to true, and so what I wanted to do is flip it around. So that's why I have success value equals to success value with the not in front of it, and so that flips it to be false. And that's why you get this success value to be false if I come down to here. So it's easy enough for me to test that. So I'm just going to set this to be 10. And you can see I came down to here. The lowest numbers are too similar. Lowest numbers are too similar. And I have the success value flipped to false. Okay. So that's that. Now, there's another bit that doesn't really get too emphasized in the learning objectives. I only kind of bring it up because, you know, on a number of the assignments, and even on some of the examples in the exam, people seem to have some problem with this. And the idea of a comparison versus an assignment. So I'm going to uncomment this bit here. Okay, so I set up some code here. And let me, instead of having it to alpha num, let me just say num2. Okay, so in this case, num1 and num2 are different, so I don't expect this to happen, right? So I have num1 with a double equal sign equals to num2. Fine, that's exactly what happens here. Okay, now if I do this, I set them to be equal, and you can see I got the Boolean test, right? And that's because they're both equal to 10. Okay, but let me flip this back, and of course it's not going to pop up, right? It doesn't. They're not equal. Okay, but what we see a lot of is people doing this, right? So when you do something like this, this is with the one equal sign, that's considered an assignment, okay? So now if I run this, well, we know num1 and num2 are not equal, but because we did this equal sign, it became true, okay? So the result of you doing an assignment is always going to be true. It doesn't matter if these values are equal, not equal, whatever, because you're not doing a comparison here, you're doing an assignment. Of course, I do the double equal sign, and that's that, okay? Now, the other bit that some people got confused with a little bit is the idea of what does a triple equal sign mean, okay? So a triple equal sign is basically comparing both on the value and the type, okay? And that's why I set up this little example here with the alpha num, okay? So let me go back to here, and I'm going to do alpha num. Okay, so I set alpha num equals to 10, but I did it as a string. And then you know this is 10 here. And you can see it came in here, Boolean test. Okay, so it was able to do a comparison and said both of them equals to 10. Okay, now if I do this with a triple equal, you'll see it's not true. And the reason why it's not true is because this is a string and this is a number. Okay, so this kind of stuff, whether it's a single equal, double equal, or the triple equal, could trip you up here. So this is something you want to pay attention to. If you're looking at this on the exam and you try to run through this pretty quickly, it's easy to make a stupid mistake on this. Okay, so something you want to pay attention to for the exam. Okay, so let me come back to the learning objectives. Oh yeah, the other topic that was on the learning objective is this idea of the overload. Okay, so in general, when you talk about the idea of an operator overload, it just means that depending on what the data type is, you can still use it. So the example that they're using in the book is this plus sign, right? So typically you use it for math, right? So you'll be saying like 5 plus 4, 4 plus 4, something like that, and then you'll get like 8, okay, or 9, it's 5 plus 4. But here we're actually using, and you can see the example down here, right? Because we're doing a string plus a number, we're actually overloading this plus sign to do concatenation, right? So num1 plus this, plus the variable, plus this other string here is concatenation. So that's the idea of operator overload. It's not really that big of a concept in JavaScript. Like I said, the example they use is plus sign is really the main thing. Operator overload is probably more prevalent in other programming languages. So, but the book has this as a learning objective, so I put that out there so you guys can remember this. All right, so let's go back to the learning objectives here and see if we hit on all of these guys here. We got flowcharts, pseudocode, we got variables, booleans, declarations, illegal variable names, nesting, right? You got the reference for flowchart symbols. You got pseudocode reference. You got the arithmetic operators, relational operators, operator overload, concatenation. You have your conditional statements. So conditional statements like these if statements. So that's good. Okay, so you keep on going down, then we go into things like debugging, event-driven programming. So I'll go through a couple examples with these guys also. Just a general thing, and you guys know you can go through different types of errors. You can see here they refer to compile time, runtime errors, logic errors, and the idea of debugging and whatnot. So I think some of you guys had some problems with the assignments. So we kind of did a whole thing where we broke it down, we commented out code, we printed out intermediate variables to kind of narrow the scope of the problem until we could figure out where the problem was. So just a reminder, compile time error means like it just flat out doesn't work. You can't even get to do anything. Runtime means the code is sort of working, but if you put in certain types of data or you refer to a variable that's not initialized properly, you'll get like a runtime error. And logic errors are kind of subtle, and that's where most of the time it works fine. But if you put in an unexpected value that the logic doesn't expect, or you program something that logically doesn't make sense, it'll break, or it might go into an infinite loop or something like that. Okay, so I'll try to go through some examples of this when I go through some of these examples here. Okay, you might remember some of these things in terms of text boxes, radio buttons, you have these event handlers on click, on change. And you remember the radio buttons with the ID and the name. Yeah. All right, good. All right, so I think we should be able to cover all this with the examples that I set up. So let me come over here. Just let me comment this guy out. Okay. Okay, so this is the on-click event. Okay, and we attach this to a button. Okay, so you can see here we also did a function here, so that's obviously one of the things you need to know for the exam. And you can see the on-click here. So it kind of like when you do the on-click, everything you see here between these double quotes, you're essentially putting in JavaScript. Right, so this is kind of how you kind of connect up between the HTML and JavaScript. So you have the button here, so obviously you see the button, right? And then you have this click me, which is there. And then you have the on click. So on click means when I click on that, it'll execute on this. I didn't have to do this as a function. I could have just wrote some of the code here. I could have just taken this and stuck it in here. But this is, you know, just a little quick demo to show you can call a function here. So you remember how we called the function, and you remember how we declared the function. So you have the script, you declare the function. In this case, there is no parameter, so we're not going to pass any argument into it. And then it's just going to make a reference here to say hello world. Okay, so it's very basic. All this is to do is to demonstrate your button and the on-click event. Okay, so that's a demonstration of that. Okay, so let me take this guy out. Okay, so now the next concept is kind of similar, but just a little bit different, is the on-change event. Okay, so on-change, you can say on-click is when I go in. So when I click, I go in, and then it fires off the event that my code will execute. The on-change is, it's kind of like after I'm done. So after I'm done changing the values, then it will call that code. Right, so in this case, I declared another function. I'm calling that function 2, which is down here. I just put in comments here just to remind myself to mention this is where you can look at the difference between an argument and a parameter. So the fact that I defined this is the parameter for that function. And the fact that I'm passing in something, which is this, is the argument. Okay, so here's my function declaration, here's the parameter, and this is the argument that I'm passing in to this function. Okay, so the distinction between argument and parameter. Okay, so let me run this. All right, so you can see up here, I set the default value of this to be hello. Okay, so now I go over here. I can type in whatever. And then when I click outside, you can see that's printed up here. Okay. So I can do this, and okay. So that's basically handling on change. That tells you, and this is usage for a text box, and this is defaulting, right? You remember we defaulted to be hello here. And that covers a review of the text box, and that covers on change here, argument versus parameter. Okay, so I'm going to take this out here, move on to the next thing. And the next thing would be radio buttons. Okay. All right, so we have the radio buttons here, and we can see we defaulted the first one to be checked. These are the values of each of the options here on the radio button. And then the on click, I'm basically setting the values based off of that. Okay, so if I click on this one, then I'm going to set this value to be this, right? And this is another area where I think a number of people have some problems, where you're trying to connect up your text box to this. Okay, so you have your radio button here, and then you have your text box here. And so you have to kind of refer to this ID. So this text box, the name, the ID, is ref name. And then the ref name.value is here. So this is something that you can see across these objects here. You can set the value to be here. Okay, so if I run it, so you can see this very much like your assignment that you had, where we had the text box, we defaulted the value. So in this case, I said output ship. You know, we set the read only to be here, right? So you're just using this text box for display. And then the on click, when I click on any of these, you can see it changes, right? And that's all a result of these different on clicks here. Okay, and you remember you want to keep the name to be the same, so that you can only click on one of these at a time. You would never end up with both of these selected. All right, so keeping this makes you only select one. On click, make sure refer to ref name, and then you can set the values like so. Okay, so that kind of covers the radio buttons. So let me go back to the learning objectives and see if I covered everything over there. Okay. All right, I think I close up this pseudocode thing. All right, so what do we have here? So we talked about compile time, runtime. Yeah, actually, maybe I should demonstrate compile time and runtime error. Okay. Okay. All right, so this was the earlier code that we worked on here. So let me go over to here. I'm going to take out this parentheses. And then, so you can see nothing happened at all, right? That's how you can tell this is what JavaScript will refer to as a compile time error. So I'm going to fix that. All right, and we're back to normal here. Now, let me do something like this. I'm going to put an S here. All right, so it's a kind of a subtle error. I just kind of messed up the variable here. All right, so let me hit that. And you can see nothing happened. And that's kind of why it's, this is how it differentiates between a runtime error and a compile time error. So because it's running, it never hits that. It doesn't figure anything out. But now if I go over to here, I set this to be 10. Now it's going to hit this piece of code. And now I have an error. Okay. The reason why I have this error is because I put in this extra S here. So I'm looking at a variable that hasn't been declared. All right. So let me fix that. And we're back to normal again. Okay. And then logic error. Let me demonstrate the logic error when we get into the for loop. So actually, let me comment back out this code again. And before I jump into the array section, let me just double check that we hit everything on here. Okay, compile time, runtime, logic error, on click, text box, radio buttons, ID, name. Okay, so at this point, reference data across the input elements of the JavaScript program. So that was what we were doing with the radio button. So between the radio button and the text box, that's how we were assigning the value, right? Again, that was something that was covered a lot. So just make sure you're able to do that, or write up an example of it, be able to do that for the exam. Text boxes, radio buttons, appropriate event handlers, right? We covered that. Assigning variables, arithmetic operators, that's fine. All right, cool. So I think we covered on all of these guys here. Okay, so now we go into arrays and loops. So what do we have to cover here? So I think there's different types of loops, but for the most part, we can do everything we want to do, and I think that's pretty much what we stuck with for exam 2, which was using for loops. So there's different types of loops and whatnot. I think we should be able to do everything with for loops. That's all you're going to be tested on. Okay. And we'll kind of go through the different parts of the for statement. I actually put some print statements so we can do some tracing. And that's, again, that's something that you're going to cover for the exam also. You'll be given different bits of code and try to trace through the code and kind of explain what the different variables will look like, what are stored in those variables. So I'll kind of talk it through when I do the array example. We got random numbers, so I have a little random number thing in there going on. Declare the array, filling the array, traversing the array, display the array variables. All right, so I think we got all this covered here. So let me flip over to here. Okay. So we got this array over here. Okay, and just make a comment here. I put a note here to remind myself. You remember the math function for random. So you have math.random. And it's basically going to be between 0 and 1. And this is an important point here. It's inclusive of 0, but not 1. Okay? So it generates like a random number there, and then depending on how big you want that range to be, you'll multiply it by something. Okay? So let me talk it through here. So here we are defining an array of cars, right? So you defined it and then you initialized it, very similar to other types of variables. Okay? And then I just declared something called text here, and and then I set the num round equal to 0. Okay? So you have the for loop. So if you remember, there's 3 parts of the for loop. This is sort of like the counter, right? So this is set to be 0. Okay, so that starts off, but it doesn't have to be 0. It could be some other number. It just happens we set it to be 0. Okay. And then this is where you do a comparison between this counter and whatever else. In this case, we just happen to set it to be the length of the array, but it could be something else also, right? And this is kind of where a lot of times you might make some errors with this part of the for statement, and you might get into an infinite loop, okay? And that's your logic error, okay? And then this is where you'll change the value of I every time you go through the loop. Now, a lot of times you do it this way, so I++, which means to increment it by 1, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could go down, and it doesn't have to go up or down by 1, right? So you can do like this, that makes it go down by 1. And this is just shorthand. You could also say I equals to I plus 1, I equals to I plus 5, or some other number. That's kind of up to you also. So a lot of times you'll see it in this format where it starts off at 0 and it goes I less than length of the array, and then you increment it by 1. Just keep in mind, most likely when you look at this from an exam point of view, we'll probably create some opportunities to see if there's other variations of how to do this. It could be going up by 1 each time. It could be going down by 1. It could be going down by 5 or some other number. And you don't even have to do it on a length of the array. You can set some other number. So there's a lot of ways to play around with this. So don't think that this is the only way to manage the for loop. Okay. I did some things here just to kind of demonstrate some other things, even though that's not part of like what you're doing with the array. Number one, I did the math function, right? So we did the random, and I multiply it by 100, okay? And that just kind of makes it so that you have a random number all the way up to 100, okay? Here, I'm just printing out the I each time we go through, and I'll show you why I did that in a second. And then we have testing of the random number, okay? And here, this is where I use the num round here. And one of the methods that you can use to make it to 2 decimal places is to do this 2 fixed, and then you can say 2 here for 2 decimal places. I believe this kind of came through in the assignments that you guys worked on earlier, okay? And here, this is text. You remember we initialized text to be blank. Every time it loops through, this plus equals, what plus equals means is taking the text and then adding on all of this bit here. So the value of cars for that array element plus a new line, okay? And then here, we're just gonna write out all of the stuff that got built up in the text. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so here, the first part you'll see is I equals to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through. So there's a very good chance that you'll be doing some tracing of code, and you'll kind of see a for loop, and you'll kind of show how it goes from this in terms of printing it out. You can see here on the random function, we rounded to 2 decimal places. So num round 2 fixed to set it to be 2 decimal places, okay? And then here, this is not printing out each time here because we're doing this text and we're adding to it, okay? All of this stuff down here, what we printed, is this. So we built this up by appending the text every single time we went through the loop with the carriage return, and that's how you ended up with this part here, okay? So that's how we kind of traversed. That's how we have a random function spread out to 100. And then this is how we did a toFixed to 2. This is how we do append and reading off each value of the array. Okay. And of course, I'm doing like a read from the array to populate the text. Very easily, I can just be populating and putting new values into the array also. Okay, you can add to the array, you can update values in the array, whatever. That's all out there. And usually people would do it with things like a for loop. Okay, so you'll loop through the array. That's what they call traversing the array. Okay. Let me come back over to here. Let me see if I make sure I covered all of these here. Assignments, fill array, traverse, searching. Searching an array for a desired value, that shouldn't be a big deal. I'll just kind of verbally say it here. So when you go into the for loop, you're just going to do a comparison, right? So it'll be something like, if, whatever the value is, if you want to kind of say, equals, and then, the cars and the array element, something like that. Okay, so that's how you would do a search of the array. So every time you go through, you say, does it look like this, right? You do a comparison. Okay, let me see if there's anything else in here. Declare the array, we did the declare. Fill the array, fill it with random values, that's fine. Traverse the array, display the values in the array, search for desired value, find the average of the values in our array. So I'll just talk it through. So finding the values, find the average of the values. So basically, you see the text here. I'm just doing like concatenation. I'm adding the strings together. If I'm doing an average, and these are all numbers, I'm just going to be doing a addition. I'm going to accumulate, right? So I'm just going to keep on adding all the numbers together, and I'll also do a division based on the number of elements in the array, right, to get my average. Okay, so just remember this pattern for the for loop, and there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with the array off of this, and that should pretty much fill up all these different, or address all of these different points on their learning objectives. Okay, trace and write programs. So yeah, like I said, we'll give you example bits of code. You're going to trace the variables through the code and just say, what's the output? What is that variable equals to? Okay. Use the attribute of an array as the upper bound in a loop, right? And all that means is this part, right? So the array.length. Okay. Let me step out from this for a second. All right. So just put it out there. Does anyone have any questions about part 2 for the final exam? Okay. You can also cover part 1, but today's lecture is supposed to be just a review for part 2 of the exam. Yeah, if there's any questions that come to your mind, you can let me know here. You can send me an email directly, and I can cover that off for you. So remember, for the next class, we're going to cover off on review for part 3 for the exam. And I think that should be it. If there's no other questions, I'll let you guys go, and I'll post this up to Canvas. Will there be coding that we need to upload or no for part 2 of the exam? No, I think there's going to basically be short answer. So you're going to have to write the code into the short answer. Okay. All right. So if no other questions, I'll see you guys next time.